Growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, I was a big fan of superheroes, whether it be Batman, Spider-Man, or my other favorite, the X-Men, a superhuman mutant team of a wide variety of people. It just was really cool, especially if you watched the 2000s Fox movies when they were new. Those were a real good time. But anyway, today we're going to be looking at the peak of the 90s era of X-Men, when the animated TV show was airing, and now with X-Men 97 out to much acclaim, I want to take us back 30 years ago to see how the Genesis offers the X-Men and see if they are good games worth playing today. Let's dive in.
Jesus Christ, this is loud. At this point, the X-Men have already had a few console games, but not very good ones. X-Men and Wolverine are on the NES, but they're LJN games, so that gives you more than enough that you need to know. So going into the early 90s, the X-Men already don't have a good track record for home video game consoles. Enter X-Men, released in 1993 and exclusive to the Sega Genesis.
Hear the sound razor-sharp adamantium claws make when they extract their revenge. They're here. Marvel's X-Men on Sega Genesis.
System to game, sold separately.
X-Men is set where Magneto hacks into the X-Men's training facility by sending it a binary virus from the moon or something, and the X-Men have to team up to go through the various training environments to get rid of the virus. At the start of the game, you can choose up to 4 X-Men to play as: Wolverine, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, and Gambit. Each X-Man has the use of their mutant powers and a unique moveset. Wolverine can use his claws and has some aerial attacks. Cyclops has his optic blast for range attacks. Nightcrawler can teleport. And Gambit can use his staff or his playing cards for some ranged options. So you pick a character and can walk around the training facility, and just wait for the stage to start. I couldn't figure out how to actually start the levels. It seemed like after a random period of time it would just pop you into the first stage. During levels, you have the ability to pause the game and switch between different X-Men to use to help best tackle what you're running into. You also can see here that there are 4 other X-Men at your disposal, but they're only used for, like, screen-clearing moves: Storm, Rogue, Iceman, and Archangel. So the X-Men representation here is pretty strong. Lots of team members and villains make appearances here. The problem, however, this game is pretty tough. First of all, besides a health bar, you have a mutant power meter that limits how much you can use your powers. Wolverine with his claws out? Sorry, that's a limited resource. You also have a limited number of times you can switch the other X-Men. Have low health and need to switch to a different party member? Sorry, you've switched too many times. This game is also more of a puzzle platformer over a beat-em-up. Lots of jumps that are really tricky to nail, so much so that the first level even has Jean Grey pick you up if you fall because it knows you gotta get used to how this platforming is. Even getting good height to get to certain platforms feels inconsistent. A lot of times I wasn't sure if I could even make jumps, but they would work, sometimes. Enemies can either gang up on you or just shoot you from basically off-screen, and a lot of level design that makes you backtrack or move around more than anticipated. Level 2 has these items that you have to grab to activate elevators and doors, and it isn't really super intuitive to tell you where to go. A lot of the backgrounds kind of blend together, and I wasn't fully sure how to tell when to jump into the background to get more past this stage. The boss fights even confuse me, because my normal attacks can't hurt them, but sometimes the screen-clearing moves do. Maybe there's some sort of rock-paper-scissors mechanic with the bosses, but I couldn't figure it out. If you end up dying in a stage with an X-Man, it takes you back to the training facility, and that X-Man is unusable. Run out of X-Men, and it's game over. The other glaring issue in this one is its soundtrack and sound design. Everything is really repetitive and loud and just does not sound good. It's definitely an early Sega Genesis game with the exact tone that this game's soundtrack has. My issues with this one led me to get to the second stage, but that's about where I gave up. A lot of it just appears to be very maze-like to kind of figure out how to progress, and that is not something I totally vibe with. I like seeing the X-Men in this game, but with the difficulty, the limited mutant power usage, off-feeling combat, and awful sound design, I really don't think this is one worth revisiting. It's just a bit too frustrating with how much it limits the cooler parts of the game. X-Men on the Genesis is also really infamous for having a moment that requires you to press the reset button on your console to progress further in the game, in a way that it does not tell you whatsoever how to do it. This might be the only real noteworthy legacy this game has. Despite all that, X-Men on the Genesis at the time was really popular, and Sega did a lot of advertising for it. Reviews were pretty solid, and it was during a height of the X-Men IP given the animated TV show, as well as just Marvel superhero and comics being very popular at the time. A couple years later, X-Men would receive a sequel titled X-Men 2 Clone Wars.
Magneto has arrived, only in X-Men 2 for Sega Genesis. Now 2 can play the most mutant heroes. Sega! Marvel's X-Men 2 for Sega Genesis. Hardware and game cartridge each sold separately.
Turning on X-Men 2 immediately drops you as a random X-Men in a snowy level, with ninjas and tanks, and some platforming to get you through what feels like goes on for a little bit too long. Long enough to make you think, man, this game just drops you right in, no presentation, no Sega logo. You reach the end of the level and bam, title screen. This kicks ass, and works as a great introduction level to get you used to how movement, pacing, and platforming works in this game. Overall, X-Men 2 feels like a huge upgrade from X-Men 1. You can now play as up to 6 different X-Men. Wolverine, with his claws intact and now his health being able to regenerate over time. Cyclops, who can now angle and charge up his optic blasts. Nightcrawler, who can teleport and cling onto walls. Gambit, with both a range and melee attack option. And now 2 new playable X-Men, Beast, who is the slower but powerful heavy character, and Psylocke, who has an insane range and mobility options with her katana. This is all heightened with no limit whatsoever on your mutant powers, so you can really go all out at all times. At the beginning of each proper level, you choose what X-Men to use. You start with a generous 8 lives, so you can really afford to experiment with that X-Men and figure out which one works best for which level, since you can't switch to any of the other ones once you've loaded in. Sometimes it's better to go for a ranged option with Cyclops or Gambit, go hard and resilient with Wolverine or Beast, or just blow past stages quickly with Nightcrawler or Psylocke. All of the X-Men have a greater difference between each of them that makes them all feel very different to play. Psylocke with her various attacks and Wolverine with his power and versatility are both some of my favorites to play, and both of them can double jump. Later on, you can also unlock Magneto to play after you defeat him, and he's also kick-ass. A great example of the versatility and options you have is when you get to the space station. There's a section where you have landmines in front of Hammer Joe type enemies that can really stop you in your tracks. If you're using a melee user to get through them, you'll have to stop on the landmines and get blown up while taking out the Hammer Joe. But if you have a ranged character, you can get rid of the Hammer Joe first and then just run past the mines quickly. Being able to choose what X-Men to use for each level is fun, exciting, lets you experiment, and can even let you impose a more difficult challenge if you choose a less favorable X-Men for a certain level. The story of X-Men 2 follows what was happening in the comic line at the time of this game's release in 1995. An alien race known as the Phalanx? Like that one Super Nintendo game? Anyway, the Phalanx have contaminated a Sentinel facility, and Professor X sends the X-Men to take care of it. Over time, you eventually end up fighting clones of popular villains and even clones of the X-Men themselves. The art and sound in this game is already infinitely better than X-Men 1. The characters have much more detail and are better animated. The sprites are larger here, and I think that really adds on to those detail. It just looks awesome. The colors are also really bright and really invokes a lot of that feel of the 90s era comics. The level designs take you to a lot of great locations, and this game is honestly pretty long. I got maybe halfway through the game as I was recording footage, and I already had played for a good hour, almost 2. And it was hard to put this one down. There's a lot of good optional replayability if you tackle the levels with other X-Men to see what works best for you. From going to the Sentinel base, having a Super Metroid-esque escape sequence, going to outer space, ancient jungle temples just for example, the list goes on. This game makes it feel like you are going on all these different missions, like a proper X-Men adventure, building your team, sending them out, working together, it's great. When the game lets you approach it multiple different ways, it really hits that sweet spot for me on a well-balanced game with multiple ways to play and still have fun. I feel like X-Men 2 Clone Wars is a really solid action platformer that showcases a lot of what the Sega Genesis can really offer here. If you're going to be playing a 16-bit X-Men game, I really think X-Men 2 is the one to get. And honestly, it's not too expensive either. I should also mention that these games support 2 players, but of course, as it's just me, I didn't get to play them 2-player. But I think that would be a really cool addition to see. X-Men 2 was also received fairly well, and at one point there was a sequel to be developed starring only the female members of the X-Men, according to Electronic Games Monthly of 1997, but it ended up getting cancelled, most likely due to this being closer to a later Sega Genesis release.
And that is the X-Men on the Sega Genesis 1 and 2. While I think that if I spent more time with 1, I might warm up to it a little bit, to me, X-Men 2 The Clone Wars is really where the series shines today. And if you got it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Let me know how you feel about the X-Men games, or if there's other X-Men video games you think are worth visiting today. But until next time, thanks for watching, take care. And don't think I forgot about Spider-Man X-Men Arcade Revenge. It's not here because this game is just awful. Don't recommend, don't even look at it. Pretend it doesn't exist.